All right. Hello. Welcome back. We're a little bit behind schedule, but I don't think that'll put a damper in the conversation. So I'm calling us to the table so that we can have the round table as the kind of capstone to today's conversation. The idea here is that we open up the floor for talking about the conversations that we already started during each speaker's presentation, but also open it up in order to ask about other aspects of their work that you might be interested in, to raise questions about things maybe you didn't hear mentioned that you'd like to talk about. So for those of you who have been here throughout the day, you already know the three speakers. Andrea Russworm from UMass Amherst, where she's an associate professor of English. Excuse me, I'm losing my speaking ability at the end of the day. Her writing and teaching focus on race, gender, and cultural studies of digital media. And as I already said, her first monograph is over there. But if you were paying attention, it's not her first book. She had a book out over the summer, and she has another one coming out in the spring. She's been very busy. Burgess Jules joins us from UC Riverside, where he works as a university archivist. Over the past few years, he has also been working on a project called Documenting the Now, which he spoke about earlier today. And Teresa Zachodnik joins us from University of Alberta in Edmonton, and that's in Canada, if you don't remember Alberta. She is a professor of English with a focus on African American literature, feminism, print culture, and has recently started writing about new media and contemporary social justice movements, which she spoke about at the end of her talk today. And finally, I'd like to welcome a very special addition to the guest panelist, Thabiti Lewis. Thabiti is an associate professor of English at WSU. He's one of our own, except that he works at the Vancouver campus, where he teaches African American literature with a special focus on the Black arts movement and post-war formations of race and gender. It's great to have him in Pullman, as always, and a privilege to have him participate in today's symposium by joining the Roundtable. He's going to kick off discussion by describing some aspects of his work, so I don't want to say too much, but I will say that in addition to writing about literature, Professor Lewis has become a public intellectual with his book on Ballers of the New School, which is about race in popular sports, or popular culture in sports. That book has made him a preeminent voice on contemporary questions of how American sports culture reproduces the myths and the social anxieties that sustain racism. It's an honor to have him here for this discussion, so please join me in welcoming, along with our other guest speakers, Dr. Thabiti Lewis.
Oh, wow. Wow, I should take a copy of that and and use it. So it is a pleasure to be here as part of this intellectual community, and I think the conversation has been extremely robust. And I think that the main intent, in my estimation, at this juncture is really getting the community to have conversations around how do we, in this space, deal with these sorts of issues, right? David said I should talk about my own work briefly, and so there are definite intersections. As you pointed out, I've written a book about race, sport, and American culture, which takes on these issues of constructions of images, particularly around masculinity in sport culture, and how in many ways it reifies many of the myths that we've been talking about here today. And as I was sitting and listening to some of the conversation, and even prior to coming over, just thinking about how resonant sport culture is, which is the reason I'm not writing about sport culture. I mean, I enjoy sport, but I'm interested in narratives. And it's a great space for us to see how narrative is constructed in our society. And that's what we've been talking. I think a lot of the conversation has been about narrative, counter-narrative, contrapuntal sort of dialectics taking place. And what does that mean? I think there are a couple of really interesting things around popular culture and particularly sport that make me see connections with this discussion here today. And the first step would be just the current national anthem controversy and how a statement or gesture in protest of the devaluing of Black lives and brown lives was quickly flipped into a discussion around disrespecting the military. And I thought it was really intriguing the way in which, as I was watching sports stations, and I don't have a television, but trying to keep up with that and reading the feeds, the people that were pulled in for those discussions. I wrote an article for the American Studies Journal just examining through the lens of how sport culture is very much about keeping the populace sort of calm to thinking critically about what's going on in the larger spheres of our society. And so I think that, so when I think about that and the Kaepernick controversy and the players joining that, and even the way in which different teams have been asked to, and then the blogosphere surrounding that is another great example of how this real battle is taking place over narrative, you know, and the disgust with his clarity of narrative, and continuing to repeat it. And they say, okay, we're gonna pull in another player. Okay, Dicka, what do you say? Okay, let's pull in another player. You used to be in the military. What do you say? And it's like, I'm not talking about, that's not the issue, right? And so the piece that I wrote was saying, well, let's talk about the history of Black and brown lives being devalued and discriminated against in the military. If we're talking about the military, right? But anyway, I think that but the main thing is this question of narratives and how technology functions and has worked to sort of keep that alive, and how some of the different athletes have been trying to use it and functioning as what I would call in my book, ballers of the new school. But as I was coming here, it just hit me to think about, as we're sitting here, each one of our panelists have been talking about a really key issue, and that is, and I think you just said it prior to signing as you were signing the last book, just this question of pure humanity, right? And the value of lives, and what does it mean that we say, why are we even saying Black Lives Matter? Speaks a larger volume, right? And we're saying it because that is historically an issue. And so the reason I'm raising that is because I'm even thinking about within our own spaces, how do we, WSU community, deal with where we position ourselves? And so I'm gonna kind of go out here and hit a little harder. So we have an ethnic studies program, women's studies, American studies, that was conflated into CCGRS. And so these are programs or disciplines that effectively, no matter what, the kind of work that they do deals with taking on questions of narratives, questions of constructions of narratives, taking on issues of white supremacy. How is that constructed? What does that mean? And yet it's pushed into a singular unit that perhaps is on the way to not existing on this campus. And so if there is an interest in these sort of things, then how do we utilize our commitment to creating a different space or different world, to advocating for the re-emergence of a unit such as a singular discipline or a department as it was, women's studies, ethnic studies, American studies, because if you're making games, if you're making film, if you go off into TV, if you're writing novels, and if you lack an intercultural, I don't like using the word sensitivity, consciousness and education, then you'll say, that's problematic. That's reifying particular stereotypes. Perhaps I'm seeing an object as opposed to a subject, or I'm reconstructing a subject. And then we'll begin to challenge, as I do in my African American literature courses to students. I may show a scene of a lynching, but instead of the figure being lynched, the photo just shows the people who are at that lynching. And that creates real discomfort, because part of what occurs in our society is people coming into real discomfort with cognitive dissonance. You know, and so I think those are the kind of things on the table for the conversation. And you know, we can bandy around some different questions, because I'm just trying to start the conversation. I was looking at, and I'll stop here and we can sort of move it forward. I was looking at the I don't know how many people are familiar with the Ferguson Syllabus. So there's a great project, and the Ferguson Syllabus was started by a Georgetown professor who, when the Ferguson incident took place, she was saying, wow, there are these kids who aren't going to be able to go to school, and was it Chatelaine, is that correct, I think? And she was talking about how the focus on issue of race and African Americans' history and civil rights and policing based on suggestions, she got all these people to freely send text. And I sent you a copy, I think, so maybe we can just sort of disperse it through whatever we have. And so conversations around just the text, the film, the journalistic essays, et cetera, be a great campus-wide, and I think I'm gonna try and do the same thing on the Vancouver campus, campus-wide, community-invited sort of informal conversations. I mean, these are the kind of things we say, well, what can we do? I think that's a beginning step. So I'll shut up and sort of we can, you know, maybe maneuver back through some conversations around, you know, because I think many people asking, you know, what can we do? What can we do? What do we do to
I mean, when you mentioned the Ferguson syllabus, there's the Baltimore syllabus as well.
Yes.
And the Kaepernick syllabus.
That's right. Yeah, I'm familiar with
And
that.
the
syllabi.
Black Matters syllabus as well, right?
Yeah.
Third iteration.
Charleston.
Yeah, NYU, so.
So one answer is read.
Answer is
Apparently, right?
educate yourself,
Read
yeah.
and watch, right? Like these syllabi contain ways of navigating. And I was just thinking as you were talking that our ability to read narrative and analyze narratives across mediums is what's really at stake and in jeopardy. I think with all of these sort of moves to de-emphasize the humanities, to de-emphasize a certain type of skill set for reading and making connections, you know, across disciplines, right?
Yes.
That energy is in this moment, you know, being zapped. We're under pressure at our various universities to, you know, route people to other disciplines off of that side of campus. But I think when we have conversations like this, we see very clearly what's at stake. We need to be able to kind of keep track of the power of narrative and how narrative circulates and are constructed and are hijacked, et cetera, across different mediums and different forms, and across historical moments. And, you know, that ability to do that type of reading is really what I think is at stake. That wasn't an answer of what we could do, but I guess the answer is read and support those, try to, you know, fight for those things. And not support, obviously, I think most of the people in this room are the choir in this regard, but continue to fight for that as important and try to make it more communicable to people who are putting that pressure to, you know, on my campus, it's major in the STEM fields. You know, I'm in the English department, you know, across the country we're losing majors. We were like at 800 majors, now we're at 500 majors. There's all this crisis around that, but you have to speak for ourselves and we have to control the narrative. And I don't think that we in these areas have been vocal enough or strategic enough in being able to control the dialogue around our own disciplines and what we actually bring to the table and why that skill set is important and how it relates to dealing with computers and technology every day, right? Being able to read and have a dialogue in a certain way, you know, is important and necessary. And so being able to communicate that to the parents and to the policymakers and administrators and anti-intellectuals, whoever else is out there, you know, saying, no, you know, my kid's gonna major in accounting, you know, and I think it's about being more vocal about protecting that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also about, you know, historical significance and what's seen as historically legitimate and how we've let the academic institution define those things, right? And we haven't really pushed back against that, and that's a problem. And you know, as an archivist, we're trying to tackle it in that little space that we have, right? So we're really interrogating the types of collections that libraries and archives have brought in, you know, in the past, I don't know, 100 years or however long these spaces have been collecting that kind of information. And you know, basically what you find is what you would expect, that people of color, women, poor people, LGBTQ community are not really represented in those types of collections. And when you do find those types of collections, you know, you also find sort of this sort of history of struggle for those things to even get in there, right? So, for example, if you look at Black history departments, right, you know, a lot of those came out of the 60s, right, and that you know, and the 70s, right? And so, if you look at all of the timeline, I mean, they all pretty much start popping up in the mid-1960s because students on campus are fighting and sort of really just, you know, like begging to be recognized as human, right? So we know that the record is where you recognize sort of humanness, so put us in there is basically what's happening. And so I think that struggle, the fact that you find struggle, you know, for those types of subjects in the record, you can see that in the archives. You know, I think that's a real problem, and it just bleeds into the fact that we let the university, the academic institution administrators decide what's historically legitimate. That decide, you know, that bleeds into who they hire, what departments are created, what things are called programs versus departments, and so yeah, it's a big problem, but it's all connected. You know, collections, archives, publications that the library purchases for what departments, for what professors, and yeah.
Teresa?
I'm just sitting here really struck still by something Trey Andrea said in the midst of the last section of her talk, which is that we're being taught repeatedly to remember to forget the violence done to African Americans, right? And so I guess I just want to add that to the conversation as a complication of narrative, archives, and memory, right? That, I mean, I don't think we can be reminded of that often enough, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the trick is that we think that visual representation is doing the opposite of that. You know, that's really sort of the bamboozled moment, is that we think that that's helping us not forget, but there's something about the sort of surety of having that captured and having that collected that actually kind of lets us off the hook. I think that's where that is we see it, we recognize it, and then, I mean, just think about how, I was thinking this the other day, I was at the gym, and it was like, you know, the TVs are all on and they're all silent, and it was a couple of weeks ago with the shootings, Terrence Crutcher and Scott, what was his last name? Within the same week, and so like
Within 5 days.
5 days, and so like just all the channels were on the news, and this is just like playing, and it's so there, but in the background, it's so, you know, it's so omnipotent and so present, but not present, right? It's so every day. But I think that our technologies are sort of, and our engagement with technologies makes it that, like, it's there, but yet I'm just I'm on the treadmill, you know, kind of trying to survive on the treadmill, and then these images are playing there. And then, you know, you have Facebook, and you just have autoplay. Just like these things will just play. And so I think that makes me think of this remember to forget thing, that it's a trick that we think that the visual representation is going to secure that, like those actions for us in some way, but it has the opposite effect.
And that's,
I was just gonna say something about that, and so there's been a couple reports that have come out recently that talk about how police body cams are actually have actually sort of allowed more killings to happen, and allowed the police to get off more because, the public, whether knowingly or unknowingly, already is on the police's side, and so now they have these videos that they can either choose to release right when something happens, or they don't have to, or they could release parts of it, and so they could like manipulate the thing, however they deal with it to tell their side of the story. So what people are finding is that these videos are actually killings and violence have actually gone up, so I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, because the representation is data. So once you've captured the data, it's interpretation. Like we need critical analysts and critical interpreters to be able to like fight whatever wars we see going on here. But once you have the video cam, on your lapel, it's like, oh, go ahead and record. Because I actually read a quote from a police chief that said, great, now people can see what's great that officers have to wear this. Now people can see what we see from our perspective because it's a point of view shot, right? So it's a point of view shot that has a limited field of vision, but that actually works in the favor of the wearer of the camera. The point of view shot will be easily distortable, easily co-opted, easy to reinterpret and reanalyze,
or edit
it and re-narrate around, right? Narrate what you see from that point of view, and that goes back to our sort of spectatorial assumptions about multi-angle shots, multi-distance shots that classic cinematic viewing has set for us as the expectation. But a lapel cam is not going to provide that. It's going to give us one camera view. And that one camera view is never going to do the work that, we might think that it would do.
No, and in fact, that week that you have raised, right, is proof positive of that, right? Because the videos of both those murders have obstructed views, right?
That's right. That's the point I was making.
That's the claim.
And one camera went off, and you're wondering why? If everyone has them, why are these different?
And even the
angles?
helicopter camera, but then it didn't record during the moments of actual shooting. So
they were recording, but this is what we have, right? And so there is data. So that takes us to the next question. Takes me to ask this question, and we should open this up, right? But what types of training or workshops can take place to help mitigate this sort of misuse? I mean, because on one hand, it's this real conundrum that you have this data, and it can be mispresented, and then at the same time, you have this entropy of material that desensitizes you to the atrocities, right? Sort of like, and so at one point you're like, okay, this is what we say. It's like the Eddie Murphy joke when I don't know which one of his stand-ups back in the day, Eddie, I'm giving my age, I guess, but where his wife, he talked about his girlfriend catching him cheating, and he just says, no, I wasn't cheating. You didn't see me doing, and he keeps saying, that didn't happen, and she says, yeah, maybe it wasn't you. Maybe you weren't cheating. Maybe there wasn't infidelity taking place, and he's naked, and she's naked, and, and so at what point, with that nakedness that we see, do you say, no, that wasn't occurring? That's not what you saw, and so, what kind of training can we do to, because, I was thinking about the CIA and FBI, and we know how the news media spins take place. What can we do? What is done to mitigate the misuse? Particularly with...
I mean, you have that? Because I'm just saying more of the same thing.
Let's pull the audience in.
Yes, please.
Well, I think that it starts at an ideology. We are not teaching people, first of all, we're teaching people to do race and not understand that race is socially constructed. And everybody in this police force, everybody doing this job already has a bias, already has a set of opinions. And when you give people a gun and this power God complex, they're going to use their bias and they're going to use these ideologies they've been taught since birth, and we're not teaching people to not have these ideologies, not have these biases. We're not teaching people in elementary school, in middle school, or in college that these systems, we're not promoting CCGRS as much as we should be.
I think the sort of the myth metadata aspect of it is, an algorithmic aspect is really important too. I don't think we really know how to combat things like, I think Burgess, you said something about Tupeki's article on Ferguson. Did you ever?
I didn't, but it's great.
Yeah, like Thabiti talks about how the way that the algorithms in Facebook work, you're gonna end up with a news story or you're not, and it's largely based upon what you already think and know. So you're not gonna be exposed to something that like Black Lives Matter unless you're already thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a huge problem, and I don't know that necessarily that we have an answer to that. I don't know if anyone has a response.
I mean, I think that that's a good place to kind of like a concrete way of thinking about it, that our algorithmic culture creates curated experiences. So more and more the way we use our devices is as a sort of multi-layered mediating machine, right? It's like I will see the people that I follow, the conversations that I'm interested in, and that's my experience, that's my exposure. So the ability to be able to do like an ideological overhaul for any given person is already limited by our engagement with our devices that are predicated on this system. And when I think of training and I think of like what needs to happen, I guess this is where I'm much more of a cynic, these days. But I think it's more what Michelle Alexander, of the New Jim Crow, has said recently, which is she's no longer practicing law. She's no longer a law professor. Like she is, working in theology, and there's like, what we are dealing with now is a fundamental like spiritual crisis. Like that's where she is with it, because what's going to change an ideological system? What's going to change? What kind of overhaul can we imagine? Like I think that training, I sort of react to that in the same way that I do about like diversity initiatives and inclusiveness on college campuses. And I see people shaking their heads like, yes, I know, you know what I mean? Where it's a Band-Aid solution, where it's buzzwords, where it's appeasing to a certain audience to have a diversity initiative, to say that we support this, but to have no real like structural foundational change. And so I just get caught up in that of like, what is training going to do if the ideologies are flawed, if the way of thinking and our curated experiences are the issue and are the problem? So I lean more toward it's just an overhaul of all the systems. And I think that's where Michelle Alexander is, and people who talk about abolishing, the state mass incarceration and changing our prison system, like in all aspects, from the top and the bottom, up. Like we need to undo what we have done. We need a whole new structure.
So
attacking. And I think that's overwhelming. It's right. That's the concept of that is overwhelming. Like you have to dismantle these various systems and structures that we have in place to be able to affect real change, to be able to do something that is not just superficial. But I mean, I think that's where we are, is that we need something. And how do you do that? I don't know if Nancy is still here. Nancy and I were having this conversation after my talk, that we have to build alliances across groups, that we have too much of, individualism, all of these borders and all these boundaries, nationalism, capitalistic, investments create all of these group identities. And so all of these sort of group, I'm fighting for Black Lives Matter, but I'm not fighting for the free lunch program. I'm not fighting for this. But we have to be able to see the symmetry and the links. This is a way of thinking about networked culture, is that we're networked along those lines. We're sort of globally networked in the issues being similar or being the same, right? Across nations, all workers are united, but we don't have that energy. We don't have that mass sort of movement agenda. And I think that that's one way to address and overhaul some of these systems, is to really build dynamic, unique, meaningful connections across platforms and across lines, right? Across racial lines, across cultural lines, et cetera, to be able to emphasize the commonalities, because we're all subjects to these systems. And I think that's what it's going to take, that we need to build more of those alliances.
So that's interesting, because Teresa and Burgess both talked about people understanding history in order to understand things like there have been coalitions were key to the success of the civil rights movement, and that that Black Lives Matters, if you will, the hashtag is not an issue for Black or brown people, but for, all humans on this planet, right? So I throw out at you AB 2016, which is the Arizona landmark bill that was recently signed by Governor Jerry Brown, that this bill suggests that the state will create a model ethnic studies curriculum by 2019. Encourages every high school in the nation's most populous state to offer an ethnic studies course to all 9 through 12 grade students. So,
California. California, right?
no, that was Arizona. Yeah, but things like
There's
that
something like that in
is
California,
you say,
too,
where
yeah.
does it begin? And that's probably too late, 9 through 12. But no, really, because you're talking about eroding cognitive dissonance, right? I see you, but there's so much coming at me that says otherwise. I'll give you a great example. My kids have always gone to very culturally diverse, to some extent, international language schools. And it's really interesting as a scholar as I observe the interactions that I have with the kids. So I have some leisure in that, unlike my wife, I can drop the children off and sort of hang and go to different, well, my kids are teenagers now, but when they were little, they're like, oh, you're not doing any work, Thabiti, but when they were little, I would go, and I really found it intriguing observing, and I'm talking about what are the narratives, what happens, right, what I see and doesn't, and what is reality. The kids, and this is no lie, I would hang in the classrooms, and kids different, white kids, of all different, different backgrounds. They're saying goodbye, they're hugging me, they're, oh, that's Io's dad, and so after about 3 or 4 years, this is as a preschooler, by the time they're about 7 or 8, this African American gentleman who they're hugging, saying goodbye, giving a, a cheek rub, suddenly they're sort of staring at me and looking at me a little different. Now, the reality in their engagement is one of caretaking, of a positive emotional interaction, but there's another narrative that's taking place that is selling them, and they're trying to figure out, like, okay, this man is extremely, this is my friend's dad, but then there's another narrative that's coming, and even my own children, right, are being bombarded. I had to throw Disney out the damn house, right, because it's sending these subliminal messages of with my oldest daughter, who's saying, who's the bad man? Is that man bad? And it's always someone who has what? Some hue. Blue, yellow, right? However they want to play it. But, so the little kid who's no longer hugging me is receiving a message. So I'm just saying that to tie it to this question of, okay, on one hand, there's this sort of education that has to take place, but we have to be very cognizant of the fact that it's all around us. And I'm like, I can't fight this battle. Okay, throw the TV out. But they have a phone, or there's a computer. So it's entropy, right? And so the struggle is real, as they say, is real for all of us. It's not real just for people of color. It's also real for all of us who are being sullied to subliminally accept or hopefully reject those images that are being placed upon us. So anyway, I'm rambling here, but I think narratives like that give us an idea of just sort of saying, yeah, okay, have I seen that? How does that function? What does that mean, right? Or if I'll tell the story about my daughter who grows up in Portland, and as we're driving, she always says, this one's gonna blow you away, you'll like this. So we should give the homeless people, we should have bags for the homeless people because they're all around. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So we keep this stuff, and so we take a trip to St. Louis when they're still little kids, not double digits. And I'm getting on the Metrolink. Anyone been to say they have a Metrolink that takes you around? And brother, African American gentleman, I'm sorry, a brother walks up to me and he's asking for some money, and I'm like, so I'm in my mode, and I'm like, dude, no, And my daughter has never seen me sort of, like, hey, because you're trying to make sure you're watching yourself. And you're like, no, get out of here, no. And so she comes up and she said, Dad, why are you being mean to that man? I said, he's just, he's begging for some money, blah, blah, blah. She said, well, what's wrong with him? Is he ill? Is he sick? I said, no, there's nothing wrong. He's poor, he doesn't have money. And she says, well, that can't be the case. Black people aren't poor. I said, well, what? So I grew up in North St. Louis, you know. But what she's saying is her reality, what she sees in the Pacific Northwest, where 95% of the population is white, is that very many people who are white are poor and homeless, right? Now, I have to check her on the other dynamics of, you know, let's look at a larger spectrum, but so what does that mean, right? That's really sort of deep. And so as we engage these kind of dynamics, how do you begin to not laugh when you hear the political elections and they're talking about the middle class? I'm thinking, am I at a comedy show? And people are like, what is he talking about? Because there's no big middle class, right? There's have-nots and have, and that the haves are what my youngest daughter called, which blew me away, we live in an oligarchy, right? Like, where the hell you learn that word? But so
Disney.
So what does that do? What I'm trying to really talk about is how do we break these sort of this sort of cognitive dissonance even around race and what whiteness means, and begin to see the real picture of what is the world we really live in, and why aren't there coalitions? Why? And what is invested in the entropy that keeps showing you, right, these stereotypes and narratives that you can't shake out of to see, right, the reality, which is why slavery lasted so long and you had so many poor white farmers. They were willing to accept whiteness over breaking down the plantations owners who had a monopoly, right? And so, you know, and so anyway, I'm here I go. I'm rambling. I'm taking too long, but I just like to engage us in narratives and stories to get us into thinking about what do we do? Where are we? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, and I was teaching earlier today, so I couldn't come to your panel. So I apologize if you've talked about this already. But on the note of narrative, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about privilege and privilege and white privilege or male privilege, whatever privilege you want to talk about, how you think about privilege and narrative. And perhaps, you know, you could take that any direction you want to, but people have brought up white supremacy. It strikes me that white supremacy and privilege are the two most uncomfortable things for many white Americans to think about, much less engage in discussion about. And I was wondering if you could just talk about how you see privilege and narrative in any shape or form.
Yeah, well, I think that you could take the remember to forget and move it there, right? So that I think that one of the ways in which whiteness works is this schooling to remember to forget that what you enjoy is privilege, and instead to understand it somehow as right or as meritocracy, and that doesn't move, right? That stays within this circle of whiteness. So I think, you know, there's a different narrative, obviously, to be told about whiteness, and also I think acts of. We were talking earlier, Trandrea and I, when she was signing books about a politics of refusal, and I mean one way to think of a politics of refusal is to refuse that narrative, right? As a white person, to actively refuse that, to insist that you're going to remember what you're schooled carefully to forget, I suppose, right? But I'm thinking also about Roger's point about algorithms and silos as we talked about them earlier, right? And I'm not going to remember the person's name, but it came out around Netflix, a referral device that actually built an algorithm that would refer you or recommend to you things that were unlike what you had chosen to view, right? And I wonder about that in other places, right? Because I think that, you know, again, I'm not going to remember the person who talks about this, but there is this way of talking about social media as building and perpetuating tribal thinking, right? Through that siloing, through the way in which we just keep able to feed back to ourselves narratives that confirm what we already think we know or what we would like to believe or want to remember, right? And so when we think about taking down, I guess, I'm waiting for the person who will write the algorithm that builds a platform that's going to refer me to stuff that I might not be seeking, right?
Yeah.
That is unlike what I'm looking at. Now, on the one hand, I don't want to, because that'll take me to a lot of hate, white supremacist, awful stuff. But I think there's something in that about how to break out of those silos because of what they preserve and keep perpetuating, right?
Yeah, just this idea of a silo, I agree that there are these problems of culture being partitioned, but Professor Russman was showing us the problem of information writ large across culture. And it seems as though we really need these smaller cultural spaces to actually create a sort of kind of positive impact. And so since we're talking about narrative, I wonder if we could talk about this in terms, I don't know, of like subgenre or of, you know, smaller groups where we're still forming connections, but not necessarily attempting to completely break them down. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's purposeful. Like, smaller subgroups are not the problem, right? Like, silos and small communities and reading rooms, like, forming groups around interests is not the problem.
Sometimes it's not the problem.
Sometimes not the problem. Well,
Sometimes
that
it
in and of
is the problem.
itself is not the problem. That in and of itself is not the problem.
Okay.
It's still being able to, like, well, at least around culture, right? Like, around, like, cultural participation and consumption. I mean, in my mind, that's not really the problem. It's to be able, we talk about multidimensionality of our subject hoods all the time, and code switching, right? So what you think about is, okay, I'm in one community when I go to work, you know, when I show up at my university, I'm in that community. I'm in another community at the comic book store. Like, I don't actually see a problem with belonging in all these different spaces and activating some meaningful, you know, discussions around that particular space. Like, this is actually really meaningful to me. The problem is when we don't realize our multidimensionality in that way. That, to me, is the sort of subjective challenge for us. And aligning that with these sort of like political imperatives and political interests too, right? So to be able to say that I am one person in the comic book store and another person at work, but there's facets of me that are consistent between those spaces, and those facets of me can actually be, you know, on the front lines with, you know, the Native Americans fighting for like clean water and to protect their spiritual spaces. Like, all of that is consistent, all of that is fluid. And I think that that's the way we have to be able to talk about this, is that we can exist in all these different spaces, but it's not an exclusive existence. It's not an exclusive space. And so, I mean, this is getting us back to the post-structuralist, you know, but it's a way of thinking about identity and subject formation that doesn't dismiss any kind of core essential self or essential set of needs, but still kind of animates those older conversations that we've had about how subjectivity is really sort of formed and maintained. So I think that that's how I think of that. And
You know, and that's great, because we should use the way people deal with gender identity formation, or, you know, what does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be feminine, right? In the same ways we engage this question of just in general, right? I'm not just a black guy, he's not just a white guy, she's not just, you know what I'm saying, is that there are multiple dynamics of what construct that persona. And if you only see it in that way, then you need to start create a cluster and begin to build off of it to say, okay, what all am I, or what else can I be? What other spaces can that one circle extend off to that would make you see, you know, where you're.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be, it's not realistic to me for us to all be together all the time, right? Like, that's just not a realistic, like, existence or reality for our lives. But maybe another thing that we need to throw out there is that we come together around an articulation of needs too, right? That we're able to see those commonalities a lot more when we talk about our, like, because I like to sort of distance us from seeing ourselves as all people and all humans, right? Like for obvious reasons in the previous hour of talking about it, like there's a limiting discourse there that I think we try to recapture and perpetuate when we try to build those alliances, but I don't think that's the right one. So I don't know what other, discourse we need, but it's certainly not we're all people together, because then we get lost in these conversations about like, well, trying to prove our humanity and all of that stuff. But maybe it's coming around common needs, it's coming around something else, that we kind of put out there, and that helps us see this sort of unified self, but also this multiplicitous self that exists. And so intersectionality is much more in the mainstream now, so people can definitely latch onto this and understand, oh yeah, it's all of these things are me. I'm like this person at the grocery store. When I go home, for Christmas vacation, this is who I am, and I can communicate in this community in this way, and it's to be able to create links, among those communities, which I don't think of as silos, but I just think of them as our multiple participations in multiple communities.
So thinking about when we were watching the clip from Precious, it kind of like prompted me to think about the dichotomy between the like bad black mother character and also Precious, who is a black mother. And there's this other side to that character, which is like the victim and still doesn't have representation. It really reminded me of Alice Walker's The Color Purple, the character Celie. Like I see a lot of parallels between Celie and between Precious, and I find it interesting that there was the stage revival of The Color Purple earlier this year that was also produced by Oprah, and I just find that kind of a dichotomy between like the bad mother and the victim mother kind of troubling. Yeah. But in Celie, there's also that like excellent representation of like black queerness as well. And so my question is, how do we like become better at like rejecting certain parts of characters that can be really important in other ways? Like, is there a way to educate yourself on like how to accept important parts of one character and reject other parts of how they were portrayed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm the kind of person that doesn't shy away from the stereotypical, right? So one of the things is that we certainly can get flat stereotypical representations, but I think oftentimes we're actually not seeing only that. It seems only that, right? So when we see Precious's mother in that film, we see the stereotypical like black mother who can't see and recognize her children's humanity. We certainly see that if that's what we are familiar with pointing out, right? But there are actually other things there, like that clip, showing the photography of like, this is who she was also. Like she was happy as a mother at a certain time. She had this, something happened in that, in that transfer between the Precious, the Mary is her name, that we see, throwing the television at her daughter, and those photographs that we see like edited into that sequence. So on the one hand, we're tempted to say, this is another bad black mama, which it is, but even there's dimension. Even there, if we read across text, like to The Color Purple, if we look at what's going on with editing, I think our danger is when we just compare the stereotypical or the image to the real, which is, I'm like, where is the real anymore? That is not a productive point of comparison of like, is this a stereotype or is this a real person? I don't think we're gonna get very far with that. But I think that we actually can do, even with these sort of representations that are more stereotypical than not, there's usually some other complexity there. There's usually something else that we are able to see only if we're willing to look at the editing techniques, at the other intertextuality and the other kind of cultural conversations that are absorbed in that moment, at these different modes of spectatorship, right? Like there are other ways of seeing that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely, a starting place for engaging the stereotypical of like, it's not a conversation stopper. That's what, that it's just, this is embarrassing. It quickly takes us back to the politics of respectability. Oh my God, this is an awful, embarrassing representation of black motherhood. Well, it may be that, but why is it that, and be able to get somewhere. And it may be all these other unexpected things too. And in my case, it shows me, hey, she's a test case for the politics of recognition. Like, do we recognize her as a subject when we watch that film? Absolutely not. We are encouraged to empathize with Precious, And again, the tiny little recognitions and the tiny bit of hope that we see with that character, that's where we're encouraged to be. So I think when you see a stereotypical representation, you should see it as an opportunity to test out a couple of things, right? Well, what else is going on there? Why is this stereotypical? Why am I receiving it that way?
See, that's good. This is a long hashtag, but for this, we walk away with all of us thinking, what can I see if I'm willing to look, right? I know it's not good because people are like, I make it shorter, but I just, what can I see if I'm willing to look, right? How many people have seen Luke Cage?
Yeah,
The
I
nephew.
saw it.
Great example
Last
of
weekend.
some of the conversation going on here, right? Because it takes on that multiplicity dynamic
Yeah.
with some of the characters.
I mean, I think one of the other things I would say, because Luke Cage just blew up my Facebook and my Twitter and all that stuff, and crashed Netflix. There are all these like fable, like, you know, social media stories now about Luke Cage. I think that that's a great example. Is that we actually aren't going to get very far just saying like, is a bulletproof black man problematic in this time? It has its Black Lives Matter moment in there, which, you know, my initial reaction was actually very critical of, because the way, if you haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil too much, but the way the sort of it all unfolds with the dash camera and like, hey, we're gonna protest police violence, police brutality, is all around Luke Cage, who like threw a cop in the air and like, slammed him into the car. So it's like a superficial engagement with Black Lives Matter and wasn't pointed at the systemic issues of police brutality. It sort of fashioned this weird little story around Luke Cage. And yes, it's highly symbolic, and he's wearing the hoodie and it's Trayvon Martin. But I guess my point is that a lot of times with popular culture, again, everybody sort of has a very intense reaction. I mean, it was sort of, you could see, on the streams of how divided people were, of this is only reinforcing stereotypes of the superhuman black male, or no, this is really cool because it has all this other stuff going on, like references to Walter Mosley and Donald Goins, and like Method Man, makes an appearance, like all this rich, like seeped, like African-American culture is available there, or no, it's just blaxploitation, right? We're so tempted to resort to those ways of viewing, either good or bad, or yes or no. And I mean, that's not the full conversation. It's not the full conversation, and it's not the full kind of media studies analysis that we could do with something like that. But we're tricked into just wanting to have this sort of quick, easy answer for what that is. But, that's an example that's not obviously overtly stereotypical necessarily, but people have reacted to it in that way.
I'd love to have the panel create or suggest ways to use data mining processes that Professor Jules talks about. Quite frankly, I find narratives astonishingly dangerous in terms of what people can create. And when I think of when Professor Jules mounts his mechanism for how people can get at and use this data, I'm just curious about, is there some kind of considerable warning, so much as even what sort of ways would you like to have people actually use those data? Are there ways in which you absolutely don't want them? You want them to take some kind of way of having that kind of critical thinking that presumably you want people to have, and the vast majority of people won't.
Well, I'm not a professor, but I appreciate you thinking of me in that way. Yeah, I mean, again, you can't control how people use that data. I mean, you just can't, as much as you want to. I think, in some ways the best you could do, again, is really try to communicate your values. If you could sort of turn those values into some kind of sort of technical type protections that you can build into some of these tools, then you do that. But it's really hard once you put the thing out there and people start using it. I mean, you can't really control how people use it. And so it's hard. And so the question could be, well, why even put it out there? Because there's good that could come out of it, right? That the communities that you're targeting to use these things, like the DocNow tool that we're building, the communities that we want to use these things have good ideas for using it, for building collections that that could help sort of address some of these silences in the archival record, and a whole host of other good reasons for using these types of tools. But some people will use it to do whatever they want, and we're really not in the business of trying to tell people how to use the data per se, right, or what to do with it. And so yeah, that's a tough question. And before I forget, I did want to give a shout out to Sophia Noble's work on algorithms and racism, and she has a book coming out, I think, later this year or next year called Algorithms of Oppression. And so that made me think of your question. But yeah, I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, we're building things, we're telling people why we're building them. We're suggesting ways that folks could use them, but I don't really have an answer for, sort of controlling people's use of these types of.
I don't want to take a position saying there are ways that are not necessarily unethical, but there are ways in which this could be misused.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've said that, yeah. Yeah, I think we could say that, and we have, and I think I said it today, but I mean, what does it mean, I think we should keep saying it, but, sorry, I don't have a real answer for you, but I don't think there really is one. You could state your sort of values, but that's pretty much all you could do, as long as you put something out there for people to use.
Well, or here's the thing, how many people, and I would raise my hand, didn't know about the, what was the name of the company you were talking about,
Geophedia.
Geophedia, and what was the other one?
Well, In-Q-Tel. is the
In-Q-Tel. I
funding
didn't know
arm
about
of
that.
the CIA.
I
So
was like, whoa.
you've just contributed to
Okay.
part of the solution,
Well,
right?
happy
There's
to
no, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
that's a step one, that
Yeah.
people are aware.
Yeah,
And so you begin to question these things.
Well, yeah, there we go. And so there is another project I want to point out that's going on at UCLA right now. It's being run by Snowden Becker, who is a PhD student in the School of Information at UCLA. And she just got a grant from IMLS. They've already had this meeting where they're looking at sort of how do we think about preservation, collection and preservation of police body cam data. Or video, right? And so they had this big meeting with archivists, policy people, and actually law enforcement folks who were just sort of talking about what do we do with this data? What are some of the ethics around that kind of data? I'm not sure how that's going to end up, because we know that police are interested in protecting police. So I'm not sure how having them involved in that conversation is going to happen, is going to play out. I think, I don't know if it was part of the conversation, but I think one thing they should have talked about, if they didn't, is police union contracts, which is something that the Campaign Zero folks have brought up, and I think is going to be a key area when it comes to police reform, because the contracts that police make with different cities are where a lot of those protections are, right? So protections that say if you kill someone, then you can have 30 to 45 days to get your story together before you can talk to anyone. Or some police departments that have policies where the video cam, the recordings will never be released, right? And we saw a big controversy in Chicago recently where that has now been overturned, and historical data of police misconduct now has to be released in Chicago. So that's a big issue, and I think the Campaign Zero folks are being really creative at targeting the police union contracts, because that's where a lot of the policies and the issues around this is situated.
That brings us to 4:30. So I'm close. I have a few things to say in conclusion. And the first, let me get to the microphone to say it. And the first thing I want to say is thank you to our panelists and our guest speakers. Second thing I want to say is to thank you all. All the planning in the world can't guarantee a successful symposium like this. It takes everybody to show up and have a good conversation. So thanks to you all for being here and sticking out until 4:30. Not everybody did, obviously, so congratulations to you for surviving. A few other things. First, to our co-directors, Tim Christian-Witty and Trevor Bond, who were supportive the entire year as we planned this and who put in a lot of work on top of all the work they do just to keep this center alive and going. A special thanks goes to Michael Wynn, our digital applications librarian. He put in a lot of effort to make sure that this got publicized and to coordinate everything here, so thank you, Michael. A number of other people who work here at the center. I didn't mention this morning, Alex Merrill, who doesn't just work here, but also throughout the library to make sure that technology in the library works. Lotus Norton-Wisla, who also works here to coordinate with a lot of the off-campus communities that the center works with. So thanks to them too for being supportive. Steve Bingo, who was here earlier, but had to leave because he lives in Spokane, so a long commute. He also was very helpful for keeping things organized. So thanks to all of them. Thanks to our GAs. Lacey Hope is still here. Corinne Headland was here earlier. They moved lots of stuff, including all of these chairs and their own schedules to be here to make sure that we had help as we needed it. And last but not least, I have a number of sponsors to thank. The Department of English, the Gender, Identity, Expression, and Sexual Orientation Resource Center, the Women's Resource Center, the College of Education, the George and Bernadine Converse Historical Endowment, the African American Student Center, and the School for Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs all donated money generously to make this possible. So thanks to everybody, and thanks for a great event.
Thank you.